Morning. I'm Robert Sumwalt. Welcome to the boardroom of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the NTSB, and joining us today are my colleagues, Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg, Member Earl Weiner, Member Bella Densar, and Member Jennifer Homendy. Today, we meet in open session as required by the government and the Sunshine Act to consider the fire on board the small passenger vessel Island Lady near Port Richey, Florida on January the 14th of this year. The Island Lady was operated by Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise as a shuttle to and from their casino boat, the Tropical Breeze 1. On the outbound journey, the captain received a high temperature alarm on the port engine's jacket water system. In response, he put the port engine into neutral, and relying on the fully functional starboard engine, he turned the vessel back toward shore. Soon thereafter, however, thickening smoke enveloped the Island Lady. The captain deliberately beached the vessel so the people on board could be evacuated to shallow water. Fire engulfed the main deck and burned the vessel down to the waterline, and it was declared a constructive total loss. The passengers, crew, and other employees on board were able to evacuate by jumping off of the Island Lady, but 15 of them were injured. And tragically, one passenger died hours later in a local hospital. So on behalf of all of us at the NTSB, I'd like to offer our sincerest condolences for your loss. And for those who were injured, it is our hopes and our wishes that you are on your way to a speedy recovery. The sole purpose of today's meeting, of this investigation, has been to learn from what happened to prevent fires like this from happening again. Today's presentation will tell the story of the fire in detail, how and where it began, the crew's response to secure the safety of the vessel's passengers, and the maintenance practice that created opportunities for this fire to start and spread. We will also discuss the Island Lady's condition before the fire. But in addition to our findings in this investigation, we will consider this board's previous experience with this very company in a 2004 fire on board another vessel in virtually, amazingly, in almost exactly the same location. After that earlier fire, the NTSB issued recommendations regarding preventative maintenance and firefighting training for crew members. The company agreed to implement these recommendations, but today we will discuss whether what they did was enough. After the 2004 fire, we also made or reiterated companion recommendations to the United States Coast Guard. Was the Coast Guard's response to these recommendations adequate? Crew members on board the Island Lady were not only untrained in firefighting, with the exception of the captain, none of them had any formal Marine training. We'll discuss the captain's decision to turn back toward the boarding dock upon receiving the high temperature alarm, rather than the potentially disastrous alternative of continuing out to sea. However, we'll also discuss why the captain left the port engine running, even in neutral, once he realized it was overheating. And of course, we will discuss how to prevent a fire from happening again. The latent circumstances that we will discuss today might be repeating themselves elsewhere in small passenger vessels as we speak. All over the country this morning, crew training is either being conducted or it's being neglected. Vessels are being made safer by preventative maintenance, or their safety is being left to chance. Manufacturers' manuals are being followed, or they are being disregarded. Warning signs are being followed up on until their cause is known, or they're being ignored. Safety isn't something you have. It is something that you do. And are we requiring vessel operators to do it? Today, the NTSB staff will briefly present the most pertinent facts and analysis found in the draft report. Our public docket, available at ntsb.gov, contains over 1,200 pages of additional information, including photographs, interviews, maintenance forms, and inspection records. Staff have pursued all options, all available avenues in proposing findings, a probable cause and issue, and recommendations to the board. The order of today's board meeting will be that the staff will present a topic-by-topic summary of the investigation, and then we on the board will question the staff. We will propose and vote on any amendments necessary to ensure that the report, as we adopt it today, truly provides the best opportunity to enhance safety. Now, Deputy Managing Director Sharon Bryson, if you'll kindly introduce the staff, and good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few quick announcements before we begin. I would like to ask for anybody here in the boardroom, if you've not already done so, could you please silence your electronic devices that you have with you? In terms of exit in case of an emergency, there are 2 exits. You can see them marked on the front, one to my left, one to my right. If we do have that event, please go down the stairs, out the door, follow the illuminated exit signs to depart the facility. You can also exit through the doors where you entered, proceed through the glass doors, go up the stairs, straight ahead, and make a left and walk as quickly as you can to the end of the street. In the event of an emergency, please exit the building as quickly as you can, make your way to the outside, and other instructions will follow from NTSB personnel. Do not return to the boardroom until everyone's been given an all-clear sign. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to contact any NTSB personnel that are here in the boardroom with us. Now I'd like to introduce to you the staff from the offices that will be presenting today. Sitting immediately to my right is Brian Curtis, the Director of the Office of Marine Safety. Brian Young, who is the investigator in charge for marine safety on this investigation. To his right is Nancy McAtee. She's a fire and explosion investigator from our Office of Research and Engineering. To her right is Liam LaRue, who is Chief of Investigations for the Office of Marine Safety. And to Liam's right is Eric Stolzenberg, who is Chief of Product Development in the Office of Marine Safety. Directly behind Eric is Bob Dodd, our Chief of Safety Recommendations. Rob Jones is to his left. He is the Deputy Chief of Investigations for the Office of Marine Safety. To Rob's left is Morgan Terrell, our Deputy Director in the Office of Marine Safety. To Morgan's left is Sarah McComb, Senior Technical Advisor in the Office of Research and Engineering. To her left is Kathy Silba, our General Counsel. And directly behind me is Paul Sledzik, our Director of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Sitting behind Paul is David Flaherty, who is handling visuals for us. He is an investigator in our Office of Marine Safety. And to David's right is Monica Mitchell, who is the report writer and will also be taking care of timing for this board meeting. And with that, Brian Young will provide the first presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, and board members. I'll be providing an overview of the events that took place on January 14th, 2018 in the Pithlachascotee River, where a fire broke out on the small passenger vessel, Island Lady. The investigation team consisted of the following NTSB staff. Listed here are the staff that supported the investigation team throughout the investigation. The parties to this investigation were the United States Coast Guard, Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise, the operator of the vessel, and Ring Power Corporation, the engine manufacturer's maintenance representative. The Island Lady was a small passenger vessel built in Stuart, Florida in 1994. The vessel was originally designed as a whale watching and excursion vessel and operated in Maine for about 20 years before it was sold to ABK Enterprises in November of 2015. The Island Lady was certificated to carry a maximum of 149 passengers. The last Coast Guard inspection before the fire was conducted in March of 2017. And the last dry dock, which included a Coast Guard examination, was conducted in April of 2017. The Island Lady's top deck contained the wheelhouse, open-air seating, and life jacket storage lockers. The life jackets were stored on the stern and in the wheelhouse. The life rafts were located above the wheelhouse. The Island Lady's enclosed main deck cabin had 4 doors for egress, several tables and chairs, and a bar area. Recessed deck hatches provided access to the fuel tanks, the engine room, and the lazarette in the hull below. The vessel's fuel tanks, engines, generators, various pumps, and other machinery were located below the main deck in several compartments. Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise operated Island Lady as a passenger shuttle to transport passengers and employees from Port Richey, Florida, to an offshore casino vessel located 9 miles off the west coast of Florida. Port Richey is located about 35 miles northwest of Tampa, Florida, on the Gulf Coast. I will now discuss the events that took place on the day of the accident. On January 14th, Island Lady departed the boarding dock with 53 people aboard, a captain, 3 deckhands, 11 employees heading to work on the casino boat, 2 pre-hire employees, and 36 passengers. Half of the passengers were over 60 years old. The Island Lady departed the boarding dock in Port Richey about 3:30 p.m. and transited through the harbor of the Pithlachascotee River at reduced speed. The yellow marker on the screen depicts the approximate track of the vessel as it proceeded through the harbor. Once the vessel departed the harbor and maneuvered around the S-turn located at the end of the peninsula, the captain increased the speed of the vessel and headed out into the Gulf of Mexico towards the casino boat. This is a picture of the casino boat Tropical Breeze 1 that the Island Lady was heading for. The vessel was located about 9 miles off the coast. Passengers would transfer from the shuttle boat to the casino boat via the ramp on the starboard side of the casino boat. The next several slides will display video clips from a home surveillance video system and a witness cell phone of the accident voyage. This video footage may be upsetting to some members of the audience present here today or those viewing this proceeding via webcast. I will now pause for a moment to allow those who prefer not to view the series of videos to leave the room or temporarily suspend your video feed before we continue. This video clip shows the Island Lady transiting outbound at a reduced speed. The vessel will come into the frame from the left side between the 2 houses. 2 passengers are on the top deck, and there is no smoke visible from the stern. The Island Lady disappears from the camera's view for approximately 5 minutes. This video clip shows the Island Lady at increased speed heading out into the Gulf of Mexico after departing the Pithlachascotee River. According to the captain, about 15 seconds after increasing speed, he received a high temperature alarm on the port engine's jacket water system. During the outbound transit, light gray smoke is visible from the stern of the vessel. In the area known as Durney Key, which is the island to the left of the outbound vessel, the captain reduced the speed of the vessel. He took the alarming port engine out of gear and reduced its speed to idle. At the end of this video clip, the vessel is seen coming to a stop. The captain of the Island Lady notified the company ashore and the captain of the casino boat that he had received an alarm in the port engine. Passengers are beginning to assemble on the top deck at this time. This video clip shows the Island Lady maneuvering in the astern direction after the captain was advised to put the vessel in reverse to clear any obstructions from the seawater inlet to the raw water pump cooling system. The Island Lady is then seen turning further to the port side and headed back towards shore at a reduced speed. During the return transit, the captain proceeded to the engine room to investigate the cause of the alarm. He saw water on the port bulkhead outboard of the port engine, which he thought may have resulted from a hose popping off. He did not see any heavy smoke or flames. About 9 minutes after turning around, the Island Lady becomes visible again between the two houses. During this return transit, heavy dark smoke is billowing from the port side main deck. Several passengers are assembled on the top deck, and fire is visible from the port side of the stern at the waterline, which is in the area of the port exhaust tube. During the return transit, as the vessel approached the entrance to the harbor, a crew member advised the captain that there was an increase of heavy smoke in the engine room in the aft section of the vessel. The captain turned the vessel to port and beached the Island Lady by driving the bow into the shallow bottom about 150 feet from the shoreline. About a minute and a half after the Island Lady was stopped and beached in the area with the shallow bottom, a witness's cell phone recorded increasing smoke from the Island Lady's starboard side. The wind was blowing from the Island Lady's port side to the starboard side. Several people were seen jumping from the bow into the water and walking towards shore. The water depth by the bow was about knee-high, and the reported water temperature was 56 degrees. At this time, there were no flames visible in the main deck or on the top deck of the vessel. About 2.5 minutes after the vessel was beached, a crew member removed the port side passenger loading door on the main deck, which gave passengers and employees a means of egress closer to the waterline. About a minute later, flames in the aft section of the main deck become visible through the port side aft windows. Passengers are seen evacuating the vessel through the open port side loading door and jumping from the bow. Within 30 seconds of the fire starting on the aft part of the main deck, flames are seen engulfing the entire main deck, and heavy smoke is billowing from the wheelhouse. People are seen jumping from several locations from the burning vessel, including the top deck. The passengers, employees, and crew walked and waded to the shore. Everyone on board evacuated the burning vessel and were assisted by first responders and residents of the community near the beached vessel's location. 15 people were taken to local hospitals, and 1 passenger died hours after the fire. This concludes the series of videos for this presentation. In 2004, the Express Shuttle 2, owned by the same company, caught fire in nearly the same location as the Island Lady. The accident was declared a major marine casualty, and the NTSB investigated. The NTSB was notified by the Coast Guard of the fire aboard Island Lady on the evening of the fire. Although it didn't meet the threshold for a major marine casualty, the NTSB used its authority to investigate this accident because of a recurring character. After the fire, investigators examined the Island Lady wreckage. The vessel burned completely to the waterline. The photos in the slide show some piping systems, damaged handrails, deck chair frames, fuel tanks, engines, and generators, which were the only identifiable components. Investigators located the heavily damaged port engine underwater, seen on the left slide, and the partially submerged, heavily damaged starboard engine on the right slide. About a month after the accident, the engines were salvaged from the vessel and transported to a secure facility for inspection. This slide shows both engines in a container after the salvage. I will now discuss the safety issues and findings that were identified in this investigation. The safety issues that were identified were the lack of company guidance regarding engine high-temperature alarms, the lack of fire detection in unmanned spaces with exhaust tubing, insufficient preventive maintenance, insufficient crew training and documentation, inappropriate material and design of fuel tank level indicating systems. Staff excluded the following as causal factors. Staff believes that weather, fatigue, and impairment due to alcohol and other drugs were not factors in the accident. Based on interviews with the captain and crew, as well as the shoreside videos, investigators learned that a high-temperature alarm for the port engine's jacket water system was received during the outbound transit. The jacket water system is a closed-loop system that cools internal components of the engine. The diagram on the screen is a simplified description of the cooling system. The raw water system is shown in green, and the jacket water system is shown in blue. The jacket water system is cooled through a heat exchanger by the raw water system, which uses seawater pumped via an engine-driven pump. The seawater cools intake air for the engine, the jacket water system, the reduction gear, and then is sprayed directly into the exhaust tubing to cool the exhaust gases. The captain stated that he saw water on the outboard bulkhead when he went to investigate the alarm. This is consistent with the position of the raw water pump on the port engine. Loss of the raw water pump would result in elevated jacket water temperatures, as well as an increase in exhaust gas temperatures. Staff believes that the high-temperature alarm for the port engine's jacket water system resulted from a failure of the port engine's raw water pump. After receiving the high-temperature alarm, the captain reduced the speed of the port engine to idle and took it out of gear. The port engine continued to run throughout the return transit. Without cooling water, the idling engine continued to generate heat within the engine and the exhaust system tubing. The captain spoke with the port captain ashore, and he was advised to put the vessel in the astern direction, but he was not advised to shut it down. Post-accident examination of the port engine revealed a crack in a cooling water passage, as indicated in the left slide. It indicates excessive heat in the jacket water system. Surveillance video on the right slide captured flames coming from the port side exhaust tube on the stern of the vessel during the return transit, indicating a fire within the exhaust tubing. Staff believes that the captain's decision to run the port engine in an overheated condition, even though the starboard engine was available and functioning normally, allowed the port engine to overheat to failure and the engine's exhaust tubing to ignite. Staff also believes that Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise did not provide adequate guidance to its crew regarding response to engine alarms. After stopping the vessel, the captain turned the island lady around and headed back to shore. He beached the island lady about 150 feet from the shoreline, which allowed passengers, employees, and crew to access land. If the fire would have broken out further into the Gulf of Mexico, evacuation would have been more challenging. The picture in this slide shows the proximity of the vessel to the shore. Staff believes that the captain's decisions to return the vessel to the dock after receiving the high-temperature engine alarm and to subsequently beach the island lady when smoke overwhelmed the vessel were prudent and increased the likelihood of survival for those on board. Investigators interviewed shoreside company staff, consulted the engine manufacturer's operation and maintenance manual, and reviewed company maintenance documents. Several facets of the manufacturer's recommended maintenance areas were not included in the company's maintenance records. The picture on the left slide shows water leaking from an engine-mounted pump. The picture on the right slide shows the condition of a raw water pump in March of 2017 before the impeller was replaced. In the same month, the starboard engine was overhauled, but the port engine was not. The company did not track running hours on the engines. Staff believes that the company's lack of inspections and infrequent maintenance likely resulted in undetected wear-related damage, causing the port engine's raw water pump to fail. The Caterpillar Operation and Maintenance Manual provided a maintenance schedule based on engine service hours or specific time intervals. The manual included instructions for inspections and replacements. Staff believes that if Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise had followed Caterpillar's recommended maintenance schedule for the Island Lady's propulsion engines, the failed raw water cooling pump would have been inspected and likely replaced. Staff has proposed a recommendation to address this issue. During the investigation, investigators obtained pictures of the Island Lady's fuel tank level indicating system. Each of the 3 tanks utilized a piece of plastic tubing as a level indicator with a manually operated ball valve. This setup was not in accordance with the regulations. The plastic tubing was not protected from impact and was more likely to melt when exposed to high temperatures. The isolation valve was not self-closing, which could result in an unwanted release of fuel. Staff believes that the use of plastic tubing on local tank level indicators and a lack of automatic shutoff valves resulted in a release of diesel fuel, which contributed to the severity of the fire. During an inspection of the Island Lady months before the fire, staff believes that the Coast Guard did not correctly assess the fuel system's compliance with the applicable regulations. Staff has proposed a recommendation to address this issue. This concludes my presentation. Our fire and explosion investigator from the Office of Research Engineering will now discuss the cause of the fire and related findings.
Good morning. My presentation will cover the origin and cause of the fire and other fire-related findings. In my presentation, I will discuss the initiation and propagation of the fire, automatic fire detection, and crew firefighter training and response. The fire on board the Island Lady likely originated in the port engine's fiberglass exhaust tube. As shown previously in the shoreside surveillance video, flames were seen coming from the port exhaust opening on the vessel's stern before fire was visible elsewhere on the vessel. This indicated that the initial fire was in the exhaust tubing. Staff determined that the loss of raw water led to the elevated engine operating temperatures. This also resulted in increased temperatures in the normally water-cooled wet exhaust tubing. This increase degraded the tubing material and eventually led to ignition. The fire would have then spread to the surrounding wood supports and eventually through the rest of the vessel. As required by regulation, the Island Lady had an automatic fire detection system in the engine room. The captain stated that the Island Lady's fire detection system never sounded during the fire, which is logical given that the fire did not originate in the engine room. The area of fire origin, the lazarette, as seen in the slide from a similarly designed vessel, was not required to have an automatic fire detection system, nor was the space equipped with one. Further, the lazarette was unmanned, making early fire detection by the crew unlikely. Early detection is critical to extinguishing a fire. The earlier a fire is detected and responded to, the better the chance of extinguishing it before it spreads beyond control. Staff believed had the Island Lady been outfitted with automatic fire detection in the lazarette, the fire and its location would have been identified earlier, providing the opportunity for swifter response. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. When the high temperature alarm for the port engine sounded, there was no obvious indication of fire on board the Island Lady. The crew stated that they saw steam or light smoke in the engine room, but no other obvious signs of fire. They tried to identify the source by lifting the access hatches to the engine room multiple times, as well as by entering the space. The deckhands indicated in their interviews that a hatch was possibly left open after the initial check of the engine room. Leaving the hatch open could have supplied the fire with oxygen once the fire spread to the engine room. After the captain was informed of conditions in the engine room, he directed the crew to open the main deck doors to air out the enclosed main deck. Doing so would have allowed more oxygen to reach a fire. Basic marine firefighting procedures includes closing all vents, doors, and all other openings to a fire to limit oxygen to that fire. Staff believes the deckhands and the captain's actions exhibit the crew's lack of an understanding of basic marine firefighting principles. Regulations require that crew members know their emergency duties before getting underway. It is also required that captains conduct sufficient fire drills to ensure that crews are familiar with fire-related duties. However, only the senior deckhand on the Island Lady had participated in a recent fire and emergency drill. The other deckhands had not yet undergone any recent emergency training, including fire drills. Following the Express Shuttle 2 fire in 2004, the company accepted an NTSB recommendation to develop and implement a crew training program in marine firefighting. Based on the company's correspondence, the NTSB classified that recommendation closed acceptable action in December 2006. However, staff believes that the circumstances of the Island Lady fire suggest that crew members were still not proficiently trained in marine firefighting practices. Staff has proposed recommendations in this area. This concludes my presentation.
That concludes the staff presentations, and staff is ready to receive questions.
Mr. Young, thank you very much. And Mr. Curtis, congratulations to the Office of Marine Safety for completing this investigation in a very timely manner. It's a very good report. I understand that you have initiated 40 investigations this calendar year. So you're very busy, and yet you're able to get this one done in a timely fashion. So thank you for that. We'll now turn to board member questions, beginning with the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This seems like deja vu all over again with this particular operator. I understand on March 21st of 2017, there were 2 Coast Guard officers who inspected the vessel while it was underway to observe various drills, including a fire drill. And there were 7 deficiencies noted, and yet there seemed to be nothing noted on their inability to properly fight fire. Was there any discussion on that, to your knowledge?
There was no discussion about it. It was noted in the report that the onboard drills were conducted in a manner that met regulations.
Okay. Do the regs require that new hires be trained in various duties, including firefighting, before serving in passenger carrying operations?
The regulations require the company and/or the captain to conduct drills and ensure that the crew is aware of their emergency stations and their duties in an emergency situation.
Okay, so it appears like the requirement is there, but it wasn't met. Is that a fair statement?
The logbook for the drill record for the entire year was lost in the fire, but we obtained the logbook for the time period of November of 2015 through January of 2017. And in that time, there were 3 fire drills that were recorded in the drill.
Were these with the same crew members?
No, there were various crew members, but the names weren't listed in the logbook.
Okay. The other thing is, when there's an emergency or a pending emergency on board a vessel, isn't it normal procedure to issue an alert call known as a pon-pon call? And did the captain do that?
The company had an emergency procedures guide that was a written manual that described the various duties in the event of a fire, and some of the steps that were to be taken in the event of a fire were to assemble the crew, sound the alarm, distribute life jackets, and isolate the air into the affected space.
Okay, so, but there was nothing in the procedure that said they would broadcast over VHF on Channel 16?
There was a step in there to notify the Coast Guard. Yes, there was.
Okay, all right, thank you. The discussion regarding daily engine room checks. And I believe you said that the investigators were asked to see the checklist and so forth, and they said there were none provided. What happened there in terms of the record keeping, if you will, and how would anyone determine whether they were carrying those out?
During an interview, we asked some of the crew as well as the company officials about the daily checklist, and those paper copies were retained aboard the vessel and destroyed in the fire. So we were able to obtain a blank sample from the shoreside computer, but we did not receive any completed daily checklists due to the fire on board the vessel.
Would it make sense under these circumstances to perhaps require that documentation of this sort be kept in some place so that if the vessel goes down or catches fire, that at least there would be some records available?
Yes, that would be prudent, and there have been cases where shoreside computers do receive daily or monthly logs throughout other companies.
But this operator obviously didn't do that.
Not for the Island Lady daily records. The maintenance records were kept on a shoreside computer, so we were able to obtain those.
Okay. No further questions, Mr. Chairman, at this time.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Member Weiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The raw water pump was an item that failed early in this sequence of events. Is that an unusual part to fail? And what is the failure mode of the raw water pump?
The raw water pump has a rubber impeller, which is a wearable item, and the manufacturer has specific guidance on an interval to inspect it for wear based on conditions as well. If you're operating in an area that's shallow and sandy and abrasive water conditions, it will tend to wear away that impeller in a quicker time frame. And that's identified in the Caterpillar manual, saying that if you are operating in severe conditions, to increase your inspection routine to inspect for further wear. But to answer your question, it is a wearable rubber impeller that is replaced as needed based on conditions.
And the failure mode is a progressive failure mode or a sudden failure?
These pumps have vanes, and if the vanes were to break off, they could continue up through the raw water system and start plugging up different components of the cooling system. But if they all failed at the same time, the engine would have a very quick failure, but over time, there are ways to monitor the performance, such as monitoring the volume of the cooling water out the exhaust. monitoring the temperature of the jacket water system, raw water system. So there should be some sort of indication that the pump is not performing up to specs.
So the raw water system would not have the volume flow through, so it would be hotter, which is where we had the problem with this in the fire in the exhaust. So is this an expensive part?
It's not that expensive, it's relatively inexpensive. And as you stated before, staff believes that the raw water pump was the failure because of the elevated temperatures in the exhaust system. And the location of the water on the bulkhead that the captain saw was on the same side of the engine as the raw water pump. If it had been the jacket water pump that had failed, we believe that the water spray would not have gone to the port side because that pump is located on the starboard side. And the exhaust temperatures would have still been cooled with the raw water pump if that was still running.
So it's a progressive failure that can be detected by watching engine instrumentation and temperatures and so forth?
Yes, on the bridge or the wheelhouse, there was a temperature gauge for the jacket water system. And the captain did say, upon receiving the alarm, he noticed that the temperature was elevated on the port engine's jacket water system with the instrumentation available to him in the wheelhouse.
Let me change subjects here. What firefighting provisions were there aboard this vessel?
There was a fixed firefighting system in the engine room, CO2 system, and fire extinguishers, and a fire pump with water hoses.
And was any of it used to fight this fire?
No.
And what's your speculation as to why none of it was used?
Partially, staff thinks that it was a time issue. The fire grew quite quickly, and a lack of training for the deckhands in the use of that equipment.
So people weren't trained to fight the fire.
Correct.
And the sudden acceleration of the fire, you think was due to being fuel fed at some point?
Yes.
And how was it fuel fed?
We believe once the fire reached the engine room, the plastic hose on the fuel gauge likely melted and allowed fuel to feed the fire from there. In addition, the boat was wood constructed, so that also provided fuel for the fire.
Now, there was a fuel shutoff valve on the bottom of the tank.
Correct.
Was that found to be shut off, or was that found to be open?
It was too damaged to make that determination.
All right, thank you.
Member Weiner, thank you very much. Member Denzar.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the Office of Marine Safety has produced an excellent report that clearly describes how the events led to this catastrophic ending that sadly ended in a loss of life and some injuries. And maintenance has been an important issue that in this investigation that the Vice Chairman also asked about. You mentioned that, Mr. Young, that the records were lost because they were consumed by the fire. Is that standard industry practice to keep some of the records on board and not on shore?
I think it does depend on the operator and the operation. When there are vessels that have satellite communication that are able to communicate records shoreside with connectivity, it is easier to do, or vessels that are in port frequently are able to hand over some of the records. It all depends on the company's procedures in how it's handled.
And this one did not have that capability, is that correct?
This vessel did not have satellite communication, but it was in port at the home boarding dock every day, several times a day.
And have there been any changes in the procedures by the operating company related to record keeping since the time of the accident?
We interviewed the company officials and asked if there were any changes in policies and procedures, and there were none.
Thank you, Mr. Young. I know that the report recommends that Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise develop and apply an oversight system for its maintenance, and that it emphasizes the need for every operator to implement an SMS or safety management system. This company is relatively small with, I think, less than half a dozen administrative staff, including the vessel owner. Do you feel that this is feasible, and could you give us some ideas how a small operator with limited administrative staff can implement this type of oversight system? And are there other small operators who've been able to do this? And Mr. Curtis, please.
If I might. So yes, certainly with a safety management system, as we've seen in the towing industry, they've implemented a safety management system requirement, and it's designed consummate with the size of their fleets in operation. So certainly, we think that's reasonable and feasible if it's designed within that same frame of work. And certainly, we've seen other operators just through investigations that have implemented their own types of safety management systems without being technically a safety management system. So certainly, we've seen it, and we believe the safety management system on these vessels gives structure to their maintenance training and all aspects of the safety of the vessels. And certainly, I think the staff feels that if implemented and consummate with the type and operation of the fleets, then it is feasible, certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. I'm glad to hear that it is feasible and that you've seen it in other companies of this size. And I assume there are resources that are available that could assist smaller companies who want to implement an SMS?
Yes, there certainly are online, as well as the Passenger Vessel Association has some guidance. They call it a flagship program, which, quite frankly, they have checklists and whatnot online that the company could go to and establish these for their own well-being. So certainly, it does exist. The opportunity is there, and with the safety management system overall in place, that would give some just structure for the companies, but the ability of the Coast Guard to oversee these operators that they're operating safe operations for the good of their passengers.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. And I'm sorry to hear that the actual company has not made any changes since then, especially if it is feasible, as you say, to do that. And my time is running short, so I'll save my questions for the next round. Thank you, Chairman.
Member Dedzar, thank you very much, and Member Hamady.
Thank you, and thank you all for your work on this report. I want to start with some questions on training. With respect to the captain, what credentials did the captain have?
The captain had a Coast Guard issued license, master of vessels of under 100 tons.
And what sort of training does the captain have? Did he receive in order to get those credentials?
In order to receive the credentials, there's a requirement for a certain amount of time at sea, and then there's a test that had to be taken in order to successfully obtain the license. Additionally, when we did interview the captain, he went to a sea school, which did include basic firefighting training.
Okay, and did he have recurrent training?
There were no records of any training or evaluations from the company.
And Coast Guard regulations require the credentialing of the captain?
That's correct, yes.
Do Coast Guard regulations require recurrent training for the captain?
Not that we're aware of.
Should they?
There are different licenses, and some of the other licenses do require recurrent training, such as unlimited masters and unlimited chief engineers. But as far as we're aware, the 100-ton or less license did not require any recurring training.
Okay, so the Coast Guard regulations state the master shall conduct sufficient fire drills to make sure that each crew member is familiar with his or her duties in case of a fire. So who's responsible for making sure that the master or the captain has sufficient training in firefighting and in carrying out emergency procedures?
The company or the owner should be providing oversight to ensure that the captains of their vessels are conducting drills that meet the requirements. And during Coast Guard examinations, the Coast Guard examiners typically will run a drill to check the proficiency of the crew aboard. And we were not able to determine the frequency of drills in the year preceding the accident because the logbook was destroyed in the fire. But in the previous year, we did receive the logbook, and it showed three fire drills throughout the year.
So you had the logbook for what time frame entirely?
It was from November 2015 through December 2016, so 13 months.
And in the history of them owning the Island Lady? Is that correct?
The Island Lady was purchased in November of 15, correct?
Okay. Did the master post a station bill on the vessel as required by federal regulations? Do you know?
There was absolutely no evidence of any of the upper decks to inspect, so we're not aware of that.
Okay, and what does a station bill provide?
Station bill provides the crew with their emergency duties, as well as location and job functions. There was a paper copy of the station bill that the company provided in their emergency procedures booklet that all crew members were given at the time of hire. So there was a paper copy of a station bill as part of the training program.
And I do have questions about that, so I'm going to circle back. I have a number of other questions, but I'll hold my other questions for the next round. Thank you.
Member Hamady, thank you very much. I'm going to read from the report for a moment. And it says, the company did not have a preventative maintenance program. An ongoing, effective preventative maintenance program consists of elements as procedures for reporting maintenance and repair needs, retaining and reviewing maintenance and repair records, conducting vessel inspections and repairs according to the manufacturer's guidelines, and it goes on and on and on. And on the next page of the report, it says the Safety Board believes that the company should develop and implement a preventative maintenance and inspection program for systems. And then in the conclusions, it says, on the day of the fire, the company sailed without the owner, operator, or master having previously instructed the deckhands as to their duties in emergencies such as fires, as required by Coast Guard regulations. Well, what I just read may not sound exactly familiar to my colleagues because it's not this report, it's the one involving the 2004 fire involving this same company. So my question to you is, at the time of this disaster this year, what had changed from what I just read?
We asked the company that exact question, and in response to the recommendation for drills, the company produced the Employee Emergency Response Guide. In response to the preventive maintenance recommendation, they did have a system of recording maintenance that had been completed, but staff believes that the amount of maintenance that was recorded was not sufficient compared to what the operator required.
The raw water pump. How many hours do we estimate that raw water pump had on it compared to the recommended maintenance interval as required by the manufacturer? If you don't know the exact number of hours, how much greater was it than the manufacturer's recommended interval?
We asked several people in the company about tracking engine performance, and typically the engine hours are recorded, but this company didn't record the engine hours. So based on the hours that the vessel was operating, we estimated the vessel ran 4 or 6 hours a day. And since the March 2017 replacement, based on the operating hours, we estimated that there was over 3 times the amount of times had elapsed since the pumps were replaced and required to be inspected. And the manufacturer recommended every 250 hours of operation to inspect the pumps, but more if you're operating in severe conditions or in conditions that may have abrasive water conditions.
So here's the point. We believe that the raw water pump was defective. Well, it had failed, which was the originating factor in this accident. And this component, we believe, had not been inspected in at least 3 times of the manufacturer's recommended interval. Did I state that basically correctly?
Just one clarification, we don't believe that the impeller was defective, but what we did observe is that in March, the engineer who replaced the impeller, based on its condition, had taken a picture, and it showed half of the vanes were missing on the impeller, showing a deterioration of the rubber material. The new impeller was installed, but we had not seen any records of any further inspections or replacement up until the time of the fire.
So with respect to the preventative maintenance, did this company incorporate Caterpillar's recommended maintenance items in their checklist? Yes or no?
There was no record of it, and we believe that the pump hadn't been inspected or replaced since the March timeframe.
So here's my point. The passengers on that Sunday, they went out to gamble, but they did not expect to gamble with their lives. And that's what happened, because this organization did not have an effective preventative maintenance program in effect. Vice Chairman, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You echo my point about deja vu for this company by referencing the previous accident. How does the Coast Guard determine if an operator is adhering to proper maintenance and training standards?
The Coast Guard conducts annual examinations or inspection, and they follow a job aid book, which is used as a bit of a guide to ensure that all the systems on board and policies on board are in compliance with the regulations. In order to determine if the crew is properly trained, the Coast Guard examiners can review logbooks, as well as conduct man overboard drills, abandoned ship drills, and fire and emergency drills to check the proficiency of the crew aboard. For preventive maintenance, the Coast Guard can observe the operation of the machinery, but as far as we are right now, they don't review the maintenance records.
Would that be a good idea?
Part of the SMS recommendation that we're proposing would include documentation and the recording of maintenance as well as reporting of accidents, which would be beneficial in order to maintain documentation of maintenance.
So when the Coast Guard conducted the onboard drill, I don't recall exactly how far in advance of this particular incident, were these the same crew members?
I don't know for sure, because the inspection was in March of 17, prior to the accident, so it was months before.
So, but the Coast Guard should be keeping records on who they tested and how they performed, I would think, so that even if the company was deficient in that regard, the Coast Guard would have a record of that. Is that correct or no?
There's typically an activity summary report that records the findings, any deficiencies, or any comments, but in the activity summary report, it doesn't list the names of the crew members aboard.
Does that seem like it would be a good idea? I mean, we have a situation here where the crew is obviously not well prepared to deal with this, and nobody seems to have any records of anything, including the government agency that's responsible for the oversight and safety of passenger-carrying vessels.
Typically, the company would have records of who was aboard the vessel through payroll. It could probably be determined who was aboard at the time, but on the Coast Guard's record, there wasn't a crew list attached to the activity summary report. And when the Coast Guard is inspecting larger vessels, such as big passenger vessels, there's hundreds of thousands of crew members aboard these vessels too. It could become quite a challenge to record every crew member involved.
I can see some logistical problems, but I also see if we're looking for accountability and protection of individuals, we're talking about certifying individuals, and there doesn't seem to be much record keeping in that regard. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Member Weiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we talked about in the last round of questions, the fire accelerated because it was fuel fed, and it was because the sight tube was basically a plastic tube. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Are there Coast Guard regulations in terms of what material can be used for fuel lines in a vessel of this type?
There are regulations, and it requires to be a heat-resistant, impact-resistant gauge glass that's protected from impact. Additionally, that the valves feeding this gauge glass are of the self-closing type. So it is in the regulations to dictate what type of gauge leveling indicator systems are used.
So when you say a self-closing valve, it means it has to be held open manually to get flow through it?
That's correct. Typically, they are spring-loaded, so they fail in the closed position. And when a crew member wishes to determine the fuel level in a tank, you would manually press against the spring to allow the fuel to flow momentarily, and upon releasing the spring-loaded valve, fuel would automatically be secured.
So you've described what the requirements are from the Coast Guard regulations. This vessel was inspected by the Coast Guard?
That's correct, and it was identified by the Coast Guard examiner that this was not a proper setup, and the company was advised to close the valve.
Was the company also advised to change the fuel system to meet the regulations?
Not that we're aware of.
So it was inspected, and it was determined that there was a problem in terms of the construction materials used, but no enforcement.
Correct, and what we've recommended as a recommendation was to advise others throughout the small passenger vessel contingent is to advise others about this so that others don't have issues like this throughout their fleets, to advise the vessels and the Coast Guard to put out a marine safety information bulletin to advise that this is a potential issue.
So presumably, had had the fire not been fueled with fuel, pardon the expression, the fire would have taken a lot longer to establish itself, and there would have been more opportunity to put the fire out.
That is a possibility.
Okay. Let me change directions here. I think in the introduction, you mentioned that the passengers were, half of the passengers were over 60 or 65. Is that correct?
That's correct. The passengers ranged from age 18 to 74, and the average age was above 60 years old.
Which I'm finding to be younger all the time. Were there any special accommodations for evacuating passengers that may have required some special assistance or help?
We received the emergency handbook from the company, and there were no provisions in it for any sort of abandoned ship plans regarding wheelchairs or handicapped people.
It seems to me in other marine accidents where we've had special needs that there've been some degradation in the evacuation or the amount of people you can get off in a given amount of time. Was there any training in terms of evacuation for this particular voyage, or you mentioned that the crew members were, in fact, only lightly experienced?
Some of the crew members had just started working for the company recently and had not partaken in any drills with the company or the vessel. And before the vessel departed, there was a passenger safety announcement which instructed the passengers what to do in the event of an emergency. But it was just a written statement that was read to the passengers.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Member Denzar.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll give Mr. Young a break and move on to Ms. McAtee for a while, at any rate. Ms. McAtee, I know that the captain's actions to return the vessel to shore increase the likelihood for survival, but I do have some concerns about his actions in the detection of the fire. It appears that the captain failed to detect the fire at an early stage, which allowed this catastrophic situation to develop. So I wanted to ask, when the captain went down to the engine room to investigate the alarms he was receiving, he noticed steam or light smoke, and he made an assumption about the source. But do you know if he made any further attempt to identify the source? And if you could explain that a bit.
We are not aware that they did anything more than look in the engine room for the source.
And wouldn't it have been reasonable for the captain to have investigated further or directed a crew member to make sure that he knew the certainty of the source?
It would have, although they were probably not aware that they even had a fire at that point. So they were troubleshooting an engine problem.
Thank you, Ms. McAtee. And we, of course, subsequently learned that the fire started in the Lazarette area, which the captain did not investigate. Do you believe that a smoke detector or other fire detection device could have alerted the captain earlier, since the fire wasn't, as you said, initially visible?
Yes.
To him? Thank you. I noticed that 11 minutes passed from the time the engine alarm sounded to the time when the fire was seen in the exhaust tube. Why weren't people donning life jackets during this time? Oh, sorry, Mr. Young, back to you.
If you don't mind, I'd like to attempt to talk about that. Is there, at that point, nobody in the crew thought anything of a fire. Every indication was that there was an engine problem with the engine overheating. They didn't hear the fire alarm go off in the engine room. They were returning to port to fix an engine problem. And during that time, smartly, they had assembled all the crew up topside. But as they approached the harbor, the fire broke out very quickly, and at that time, the fire originated back aft where the life jackets were stored, and there wasn't enough time to grab the life jackets. But during that return transit home, there was no indication that there was a fire.
And since you're back on the mic, did anyone from the crew ever notify the Coast Guard or local emergency response about the emergency?
There were calls from some of the crew and employees after they evacuated, used their cell phones and called 911, but we're not aware of any calls to the Coast Guard.
Thank you. And I have a few questions about the Coast Guard for you, Mr. Young, as well. For 15 years or more, the NTSB has recommended that the Coast Guard require passenger carriers to develop and implement preventive maintenance programs. And in 2010, the Coast Guard Authorization Act requires both SMS and preventive maintenance programs. But I don't believe the Coast Guard has issued its final regulations yet. Is that correct? Or Mr. Curtis?
That's correct. So consequently, we've proposed the reiteration of that rec. It has not been acted on, a safety management system for passenger vessels, which we strongly support, as we said before, because we believe that's a very all-encompassing, comprehensive method to track the maintenance and ensure the safety for the passengers. But yes, as of, is still not in place.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. And I know that the Coast Guard's response to this recommendation currently is unacceptable, and the reason is, quote, lack of progress. I mean, I've worked with the Coast Guard. I have the highest respect for the men and women of the Coast Guard. I know that they value safety. So can you explain why there is this lack of progress? What is the impediment? In 10 seconds or less.
I don't think in detail I could. We don't see why it hasn't been implemented, and consequently, staff has proposed some recommendations, almost as an interim, to get certainly preventive maintenance and some training into the equation for these small passenger vessels. But certainly, a safety management system implemented as soon as possible would go well towards closing a lot of these gaps in safety, whether it's maintenance or training or whatnot. But can't answer explicitly. We've certainly asked for these safety management systems on small passenger vessels, but as yet, they have not been implemented.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis, and I know you'll keep working with the Coast Guard, and I have confidence the Coast Guard will do the right thing. Thank you.
You're welcome, Member Densar and Member Hamady.
Thank you. I want to go back to training, and this time with the crew. What Coast Guard credentials did the senior deckhand, new hire deckhand, or pre-hire deckhand hold?
They weren't required to have any, therefore they had none.
They weren't required under federal regulations, correct?
Correct.
Do crews of larger vessels have to be credentialed by the Coast Guard?
Yes, there's specific requirements for large vessel crew members to be certificated and trained prior to working aboard a larger vessel.
But the smaller vessels do not?
Correct.
And how are smaller vessels defined?
They're based on their tonnage. This vessel was classified as 100 tons or less. Mm-hmm. So there are specific requirements based on the tonnage and size of the vessel, as well as with engineering licenses, they're based on the horsepower of the vessel.
So in this case, what sort of training, both maritime safety and firefighting, was provided to the crew?
The company had an emergency procedure and safety manual which identified types of fire, how to fight fires. It also talked about rough weather preparedness, hijacking, heavy weather. It gave steps on how to detect and fight a fire, use a CO2 system, and assemble the passengers and crew. That was in a written document that the company had provided to the crew members.
So, and I have the document, but which was developed as a result of our recommendations from the 2004 incident, correct?
That's correct. That's what we were told.
So the document says on the first page, welcome aboard along with your specialized department training. And then it goes on about what's included in here. And it says safety is our primary concern and it's everyone's responsibility. I would state that, and in the transcripts, the owners state that this is the Bible, quote unquote, for the crew. What sort of specialized department training did they receive outside of just receiving a written manual?
From what we understand through the interviews, there was also crowd control training, but we did not receive any documentation that was conducted. Additionally, as part of that training package, there was bomb threat, hijacking, hurricane preparedness, and other types of emergency procedures, and that was contained within that booklet.
But did you feel that in this case that the crew had sufficient training to respond to what occurred in this incident?
Based on the interviews and throughout the investigation, staff did not believe that the crew was proficiently trained in firefighting detection or response.
So in the interviews with the company representatives, you had asked, how do you train them once they are hired or pre-hire? And one representative said, quote, they come aboard and we train them. We go over the first cruise before they even are hired. Pre-hire crews, they go through all of our safety measures, fire drills, man aboard, overboard, abandoned ship security checks. That's on their pre-hire cruise. And then once they are hired, they come to the office, they get their drug test, they take their drug test, they come back. Then they get their badge. Once it's cleared, they get their uniform, and then I give them a schedule, and they come on board, and they meet with the senior mate. And then they are an extra crew member, and they train until they are well enough to do the lines, do safety checks on their own, and know the ship. When I looked at all the transcripts from the various interviews, it was clear that the crew had no idea where the fuel shutoffs were, how to utilize them, how to utilize the CO2 fire suppression system and how it operated. One of them couldn't remember how many fire extinguishers were on the vessel. The new hired deckhand said he had no drills or no knowledge of firefighting capabilities and no maritime training whatsoever. That's a quote. He generally knew where the life jackets were and that there were 2 life rafts on board but didn't know how to deploy them, which is required under federal regulations. And another crew member said he didn't even know where the engine room was. So I think when the company says safety is our primary concern and it's everyone's responsibility, I would add it's also the company's responsibility primarily to make sure their crew is trained. I have more questions. I'll come back.
Well, you're exactly right, though, what you said there. Safety has to start at the top of the organization, and there's no evidence from this tragedy that was the case at all. I mean, so we said that there wasn't a whole lot of progress on the changes. There wasn't a lot of progress on getting a better preventative maintenance program in place after the 2004 casualty up until this one. Is that basically correct?
There was no evidence to prove that.
So just out of curiosity, and I think this question's already been asked, but I want to hear it. Do we know what progress has been made since this tragedy in January until now?
We asked that in an interview, and there hadn't been any changes in policies or procedures.
You know, this is just absurd. let me paint a picture. It's easy to say one passenger died. It's just an abstract number. But it's not an abstract number. This person who died was a single mother, 41 years old. She left behind a pair of twins, a boy and a girl who were 12 years old, who do not have parents. And here's a company that had the opportunity to learn from a tragedy in 2004. And they did absolutely nothing. And after it happened twice, what have they done? This is absolutely absurd. We're going to take a break. We'll be back at 11:05. Well, good afternoon, good morning. We'll begin in about 1 minute, if you'd kindly be seated. Okay, we're back in session. We'll begin with the third round of questions with Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Mr. Young, do you know if there were any sanctions applied by the Coast Guard to the company Tropical Breeze Cruise?
Not that I'm aware of. Throughout the inspection history and the activity summary, any deficiencies that were identified in the Coast Guard examinations were addressed to the satisfaction of the Coast Guard examiners.
Yeah, it strikes me that the company seems to talk a very good game. They put together some paperwork. The Coast Guard comes out, does a limited inspection, and then the company goes back to doing business exactly the way they did, and there are no records kept of anything, either by the Coast Guard or by the company. And that just seems like a rather loose way of handling passenger carrying vessels and so forth. In this case, the first time, I don't think there were any fatalities. And this time, we weren't so lucky. What happens next time? So that's a rhetorical question, but would the recommendations, and I'm maybe getting a little ahead, but I just, for a safety management system, require accountability for both the Coast Guard and the company to have crew members trained before they leave the dock in passenger carrying service, and would it require proper preventive maintenance, and how would that be maintained?
We feel that an effective safety management system would address several of those issues that you discussed. An SMS would identify the proper resources and personnel required to operate the vessel as well as the company. It would establish the captain's responsibility and authority, as well as the company's responsibility and authority. There would be checklists and procedures for operational procedures, emergency procedures, reporting accidents, documentation for maintenance, and review and continuous improvement is part of the whole SMS system, where a company would be audited and any nonconformities would be addressed. So a safety management system is quite a tool to provide guidance for a well-established safety management system of a vessel or a company.
Does the Coast Guard have the ability to effectively monitor these smaller operators?
Well, certainly, they're boarding these vessels, doing their certificates of inspections, but currently, they just don't have the requirements for preventive maintenance, tracking, logging, conducting. So certainly if they did, then under the inspection regime, they could be checked. But currently, as far as training, the companies have requirements to oversee their training, but through the litany of proposed recommendations, I think that would really close these loopholes, both training and preventive maintenance, if they were.
Well, that's good to hear, because right now it seems like things have sort of been pencil whipped, and if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and it doesn't seem that there's been much measurement of factual tracking of anything, either by the company or by the Coast Guard. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chairman.
Excuse me, just one clarification. The Coast Guard does maintain activity summary reports for each inspection of the small passenger vessels. It doesn't include the list of all the crew members because it's just a snapshot in time of the vessel's daily routine. So there are records of inspection kept with the Coast Guard, and we were able to review those for this vessel.
I guess I'm a little underwhelmed because We don't have people who were trained by our own transcripts in interviewing, and it doesn't appear like it's an effective method. So that's just an editorial comment, but hopefully our recommendation will address this, and hopefully the Coast Guard will understand the importance of this. I think, certainly the people do, but it didn't do the job. We've missed the opportunity twice, and as far as we know, this company is continuing to operate in exactly the same fashion as they were.
Thank you very much. Member Weiner?
I'm just curious as to how typical this kind of operation is around the U.S., where you've got an operation that is largely untrained personnel with vessels that are not properly maintained.
All we can rely on from our perspective is the investigations we conduct, and certainly at times those call-out operators that aren't following the regulations or doing a thorough job. But generically, the number of small passenger vessel casualties we see isn't extremely high as they relate to these lack of training and preventive maintenance oversights. So on the one hand, we certainly think it should be required to have these draft recommendations implemented. On the other hand, I don't think it's fair to paint a broad brush that industry in general in the small passenger vessel sector are bad apples.
Now, this vessel had been used in whale watching in the Northeast, is that correct? By an earlier owner?
That's correct. It was owned and operated in Maine for about 20 years prior to being sold to the current operator.
So one can just imagine if it had been in deep water and much colder water, with the fire accelerated the way it did, that the comment was made earlier that there wasn't access to the life jackets because that was in the area where the fire was. So it could have, in deep water, then there wouldn't have been the ability to beach the vessel. So you would then have to basically disembark everybody into the water, and I presume that the life raft was up on the top of the second deck. Is that correct?
That's correct. The life rafts were stored on the overhead of the wheelhouse.
So there would have been a real survivability issue. Just an observation. Thank you.
Member Densar?
Thank you, Chairman. And before I ask, I just have one final question, but I wanted to commend all of you on the good illustrations, especially the diagram showing things like the engine water cooling system, which made it very easy for all of us to understand. So thank you for that. And following up on Member Weiner's questions about the evacuation, I know it wouldn't have affected evacuation in this case, but I noticed also that the capacity for life rafts was 100 people, and the certification of inspection allowed 149 passengers on board. Is that standard? Is that acceptable?
That requirement met the regulations based on the vessel's certificate of inspection because of its operating criteria, where it was operating in warm water and in a coastal route close to land. The vessel was authorized to operate with the life rafts for 50% of the passengers, which was 250 people life rafts.
So it sounds like there's different standards for warm or cold water operations. What is warm water?
The Coast Guard has a very specific definition of warm water, and it was 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit as the mean low water temperature in the area.
Thank you, Mr. Young, and thank you again for a good report. That's all my questions, Chairman.
Thank you, Member Densar. Member Hamady.
Thank you. I have a question on federal requirements for fire drills. Are there federal standards or guidance? for how they should be conducted?
Yes, there are. In the CFRs, the fire drills are spelled out to be held once every 3 months. It's in the crew training 185.420. And not only firefighting, but what the crew is expected to perform in emergencies and to know their emergency duties in the event of a situation.
And then the firefighting drills and training are under 185.524?
That's correct, yes.
Is there Coast Guard guide, it's pretty short and not well spelled out in the regulations. Is there Coast Guard guidance that spells out a little further what firefighting drills should encompass or how crews should be trained?
Typically, the companies make up their drills, scenarios, and training booklet or operations guidance, and as part of an SMS, that would be included in policies and procedures in which one of our recommendations is.
How about qualifications for deckhands? Is there guidance on that by the Coast Guard?
Not for this type of license or vessel.
Okay. What is NVIC 1-91?
That was a NAVIC that had come out in 1991 about the subchapter T vessels and manning.
And we had some recommendations on that?
That was in response to NTSB recommendations, I believe, yes.
But we also had some, didn't we also recommend some changes to this document? No?
Can't speak to that one right now, I'm not sure.
Okay, all right. We'll talk about it further later. On SMS, can you talk a little, and I know Member Denzar talked about this, can you talk a little bit about why the Coast Guard did not implement SMS after our recommendations, or how they responded?
I don't have the exact wording of the response. Generally, our frustration with the fact that it hasn't been implemented over the last 3 years since it's been authorized is our position. I don't know if Safety Rex doesn't have the copy here, but generically, we certainly endorse implementing the safety management system for vessels, and we haven't seen any action on that.
So the Coast Guard had said in part that small passenger vessels are already subject to a comprehensive set of regulations promoting vessel safety, and we responded that that wasn't an adequate response, correct?
Yes, our position is safety management systems are more than that. They're all encompassing from a safety perspective, whether it's training, from the company level, firefighting and all that, from the company level down to the individual. So we certainly endorse that. But
And my experience, having worked on the Hill for a number of years, is when a department or agency fails to act, then Congress steps in and mandates it. And the legislation, which apparently they did in 2010, but it still isn't implemented, correct?
that's correct.
Okay. All right, no further questions?
Great, thank you very much, Member Hamady. So, Mr. Young, Appendix B of the report mentions the locations of fires aboard U.S. flag inspected passenger vehicle vessels. So, engine room is the top location, the most frequent location for fires. What is the second location? It says auxiliary, so that would include areas such as lazarettes, is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And that's where we believe the fire originated here, because in the exhaust tubes, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So we have a recommendation to the Coast Guard to require fire detection systems in unmanned spaces with machinery or other potential heat sources on board small passenger vessels. And this would direct, this would, if we had such a system, it would have at least detected that there was a fire situation in that lazarette compartment on board this vessel. Is that what the thinking is there?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. So either to you or Ms. McAtee, I understand that the material that these exhaust tubes were constructed of, it wasn't exactly the spec called for by the boat manufacturer. Is this, did this in any way, tell us what difference it was and if that in any way may have exacerbated the fire?
The original material was listed as fire resistant. However, the operating temperatures, the temperature range for both the original material and the material that it was replaced with were similar. The thought being is, as long as you have a proper raw water system and your exhaust tubes are being cooled properly, then the material should be fine. The minute that no longer exists, then that's when you start to have a problem.
Okay, thank you. Now, along the same lines, the fire, let's see, the fuel tank level indicator system, we've already said that was made of a clear plastic, I think it was, clear plastic tubing or something like that, and you said that it either should have been fire resistant or fire retardant. I can't remember which you said.
I think it says heat resistant.
Heat resistant. So can you say, perhaps you can't say, that if that would have been made of the heat resistant material, would that ostensibly have slowed the propagation of the fuel leak and thus fire?
It's likely that it would have.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think one final question would be, Mr. Young, so the engineer did not log engine hours, and my question is, coming from an aviation background where we did log engine hours, how do you track life-limited parts or time-limited parts or inspection intervals if you're not tracking engine hours?
That is the backbone of tracking engine hours to establish your maintenance routine, is engine hours.
And they weren't doing that.
That's correct.
Enough said on that. Thank you. Do my colleagues have additional questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back and just clarify what I was asking before. I was asking about a recommendation M-02-10 where we recommended that the Coast Guard revise navigation and vessel inspection circular number 191 so that it provides more in-depth guidance and training and drills for firefighting on board small passenger vessels. We closed that unacceptable, and that's what I was asking about. And in our reply to the Coast Guard, we stated that while it was indeed a guidance document, fire safety could be improved by outlining more in-depth detail about training and firefighting drills instead of simply listing tasks that deckhands should be familiar with in emergencies, and it does just list the tasks. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that that was closed unacceptable. That's what I was asking about earlier. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there additional questions? Ms. Bryson, if you would please read the proposed findings.
There are 13 findings from this investigation. Number 1, weather, fatigue, and impairment due to alcohol and other drugs were not factors in the accident. Number 2, the high temperature alarm for the port engine's jacket water system resulted from a failure of the port engine's raw water pump. Number 3, the fire likely started in the port engine's fiberglass exhaust tubing and spread to wood structures in the lazarette through which the tubing transited. Number 4, the captain's decision to continue to run the port engine in an overheated condition, even though the starboard engine was available and functioning normally, allowed the port engine to overheat to failure and the engine's exhaust tubing to ignite. Number 5, Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise did not provide adequate guidance to its crews regarding response to engine and other machinery alarms. The captain's decisions to return the vessel to the dock after receiving the engine high-temperature alarm and to subsequently beach the Island Lady when smoke overwhelmed the vessel were prudent and increased the likelihood of survival for those on board. Number 7, the company's lack of inspections and infrequent maintenance likely resulted in undetected wear-related damage, causing the port engine's raw water pump to fail. Number 8, the Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise had followed if Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise had followed the Caterpillar's recommended maintenance schedule for the Island Lady's propulsion engines, the failed raw water cooling pump would likely have been inspected and likely replaced. Number 9, the Island Lady crew members had insufficient training in firefighting. Number 10, implementing safety management systems on all domestic passenger vessels would further enhance operators' ability to achieve the highest standards of safety that the Coast Guard requires of U.S. ocean-going vessels in international service. Number 11, had the Island Lady been outfitted with fire detectors in the lazarette, the fire and its location would have been identified earlier, providing the opportunity for swifter response. Number 12, the use of plastic tubing on local tank level indicators and lack of automatic shutoff valves on the fuel tanks resulted in release of diesel fuel, which contributed to the severity of the fire. Number 13, during an inspection of the Island Lady before the fire, the Coast Guard did not correctly assess the fuel system's compliance with applicable regulations.
Thank you, Ms. Bryson. Are there any proposed amendments? Seeing none, do I have a motion to approve the findings as presented?
Second.
It's been moved by Member Weiner, seconded by the Vice Chairman. Is there any discussion? There's none. All in favor of adopting the findings as proposed, please signal with a hand and say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? There are none. The motion passes to adopt the findings. It was a unanimous vote. Ms. Bryson, if you'd kindly read the proposed probable cause.
The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the fire on board small passenger vessel Island Lady was Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise's ineffective preventive maintenance program and insufficient guidance regarding the response to engine high-temperature conditions, which resulted in the captain's continued operation of an engine that was overheating due to a cooling water pump failure, leading to ignition of the exhaust tubing and surrounding structure. Contributing to the spread of the fire was a lack of fire detection in the vessel's lazarette, which was not required by regulations and which allowed the fire to take hold unbeknownst to the crew.
Great. Is there any proposed amendments to the probable cause? Seeing none, is there a motion to adopt probable cause as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Vice Chairman has moved and seconded by Member Denzar. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the probable cause as presented, please signal with a hand and say aye.
Aye.
There are none. The motion to adopt the probable cause passes unanimously. Now, Ms. Bryson, if you'd please read the proposed recommendations.
So there are 4 new recommendations and 2 recommendations that are being reiterated. As a result of its investigation of this accident, the National Transportation Safety Board makes the following new recommendations. To Tropical Breeze Casino Cruise, LLC, Number 1, develop and apply an oversight system to ensure that your maintenance program complies with the manufacturer's recommended preventive maintenance program for the engines and associated machinery and systems on board your vessels. Number 2, revise your marine firefighting and job training programs, including documenting both onboard and ashore that all crew members were qualified and continually demonstrate proficiency in their duties, such as firefighting techniques and other emergency situations. And to the U.S. Coast Guard, require fire detection systems in unmanned spaces with machinery or other potential heat sources on board small passenger vessels. And the fourth new recommendation, issue a marine safety information bulletin that addresses the need to use only approved material and components in fuel tank level indicator systems. The previously issued recommendations reiterated in this report, there are two. As a result of its investigation, the NTSB reiterates the following safety recommendations to the United States Coast Guard. Require that companies operating domestic passenger vessels develop and implement a preventive maintenance program for all systems affecting the safe operation of their vessels, including the hull and mechanical and electrical systems. This is recommendation M-02-5. And the last reiterated recommendation, require all operators of U.S. flag passenger vessels to implement safety management systems, taking into account the characteristics, method of operation, and nature of service of these vessels, and with respect to ferries, the sizes of the ferry system within which the vessels operate. And this is recommendation M-12-3.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bryson. Are there any proposed amendments to the recommendations? Do I have a motion to adopt the recommendations as presented?
So moved.
It's been moved by Member Denzar,
Second.
seconded by the Vice Chairman. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of adopting the recommendations as presented, please signal with a hand and say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, there are none. The the recommendations have been adopted unanimously. Does anyone have any additional issues for discussion? Is there a motion to adopt the report as presented? It's been moved by Member Weiner, seconded by Member Hamady. Any discussion? There's none. All in favor of adopting the report as presented, please signal with a hand and say aye. Opposed, there are none. No opposition to that. The report is adopted unanimously. Does any member reserve the right to file a concurring or dissenting statement? Well, mark this date down. It doesn't happen very often, but that's okay, because we're all 5 independently minded board members. Ms. Bryson, thank you for this is your first time as serving in the Deputy Managing Director's position, and being here. I know you prepared very much so, and maybe stressed a little bit about doing it. You did a great job, and so thank you very much.
Thank you.
I do want to, in closing, thank the staff. You always make the NTSB look good, and so thank you very much. To my colleagues, you all did the heavy lifting on this. Usually I will write a memo to staff after I meet with them individually. I didn't. You did all the heavy lifting on this, and I think the report is a lot better as a result of your suggestions to staff. So thank you. Thanks for the preparation going into the board meeting. My thanks to the entire investigative team for the good work. But as I like to say, nothing happens around here without a lot of great support staff. So a sincere thank you to the support and the program staff who supported the investigation. The NTSB works closely with the U.S. Coast Guard in marine investigations, and the Coast Guard, of course, is committed to safety. In fact, one of its predecessors was even called the United States Life-Saving Service. But the NTSB provides a needed independent view that can help to improve both marine safety, both the safety of the marine industry and the Coast Guard itself. Today, we saw a passenger vessel that passed inspection with level indicators constructed of plastic tubing when the regulations clearly demanded fire-resistant material. We hope that our recommendation for a marine safety information bulletin helps to prevent such practices. More broadly, we hope that our recommendations for required preventative maintenance programs, crew firefighting training, fire detection systems in unmanned spaces, and safety management systems are acted upon. And the word SMS, safety management systems, is 3 straight nouns. It makes us expect that we can go out and buy a binder stamped SMS and be done with it. Well, I've got news for you. It doesn't work that way. Let's dig out the hidden verb here. An SMS is a business process for managing safety. Safety documents are written and they're necessary for SMS, but they're not sufficient. Safety is not something you have, it's something that you do, and it's something that you must do continually. The recommendations issued today and reiterated today, if acted upon, will result in continual efforts towards better maintained vessels, better trained crews, and better safety management. In just a moment, I'm going to do this to end the board meeting. After I do that, though, I would like for you to stay just for a moment. So we do stand adjourned. So what I wanted to say was that this was the final board meeting for our dear colleague, Bella Denzar, whose term expires at the end of the year, and she will be departing the board. Bella was sworn in as a board member in March of 2015. She served shortly thereafter. She was appointed by President Obama to be the vice chairman of the board, and she even served a brief stint as the acting chairman. She chaired board meetings on aviation and highway, and furthermore, she chaired investigative hearings as well. Most recently, the investigative hearing last month of the Southwest Flight 1380. Before coming to the board, Bella served as a U.S. Director, Road Safety Director, and a UN representative for the FIA Foundation, an international road safety philanthropy. Bella, I think I'd be selling you short if I said that you came here with a wealth of passion and knowledge about road safety. Yes, you certainly did that, but I think it's more accurate to say that you came here with a passion and knowledge about safety in general, which you had been applying in the highway mode. You quickly showed yourself adept at cutting to the core of issues in every mode of transportation, from your work as a board member on scene of several accidents, including last year's accident involving Amtrak 188 in DuPont, Washington, and board member on scene for the El Faro, which 1 year ago tomorrow we had our board meeting for. And you chaired, as I mentioned, the recent investigative hearing on Southwest 1380. From the very beginning, you've displayed a combination of keen insight, a rigorous mind, a deep caring for the human lives that our work in safety can preserve. And I will add, too, that you've been a formidable debating partner as well. But we will miss you. We'll miss your voice as a board member. Thank you, and Godspeed, my friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Sumwalt Robert, for those very kind remarks. It's been a true privilege serving on this board with all of you and with the good men and women of the NTSB staff, as well as the organizations outside who have helped us in our life-saving mission. And as my term ends, I often think of one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain that says, "Always do right. It will gratify some people and astonish the rest." And I think that exemplifies the spirit, the independent nature of the NTSB. So I appreciate President Obama and the U.S. Senate in entrusting me to this important role, and I wish all of you the very best as you continue serving the American people. Thank you.
Well, this time for real, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.